In Lincoln Middle School's cafeteria, a 12-year-old boy with cerebral palsy was about to face viral humiliation. What started as defending a younger student took a shocking turn when he encountered systematic cruelty captured on video. Marcus Thompson wasn't your typical seventh grader. For years, he'd navigated a world seeing his disability first, known for quiet moral courage. When Tyler Brennan's harassment escalated, he had no idea he was walking into a social media nightmare. Marcus stood his ground, leading to his father calling the brotherhood. What began as parental intervention would become community transformation. Lincoln Middle School would never be the same. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. David Thompson's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, than necessary as he navigated the unfamiliar streets of Millbrook, Pennsylvania. The town felt too quiet, too exposed after years of military bases with their controlled environments and predictable protocols. Here, everything seemed to operate on unspoken rules he couldn't quite decipher. "You nervous, Dad?" Marcus asked from the passenger seat, adjusting his forearm crutches with practiced efficiency. David caught his son's knowing look in the rear-view mirror. At 12, Marcus possessed an uncanny ability to read people's emotional states. A skill born from years of navigating a world that often treated him as either invisible or pitiable. His cerebral palsy affected his mobility and speech patterns, but it had never touched his sharp intelligence or the quiet determination that reminded David so much of himself at that age. "Just checking the route," David replied, though they both knew he'd memorized every turn to Lincoln Middle School 3 days ago. The truth was harder to admit. Leaving Marcus anywhere felt like abandoning his post, a betrayal of the protective instincts that had kept his squad alive through 3 tours in Afghanistan, but civilian life demanded different sacrifices, different forms of courage. "It's going to be fine," Marcus said, his words slightly slurred but perfectly clear to anyone who took the time to listen. "Ms. Coleman seems nice, and you checked the accessibility reports twice." David smiled despite his anxiety. His son had inherited Sarah's pragmatism along with David's stubborn streak, a combination that served him well in navigating the challenges his disability presented. Lincoln Middle School loomed ahead, a sprawling brick complex that housed nearly 800 students. David's trained eye automatically catalogued exit routes, security weaknesses, and potential threats. Too many windows, too many blind spots, too many variables he couldn't control. "Remember what we talked about," David said as they pulled into the accessible parking space he'd requested. "If anyone gives you trouble, tell a teacher, document everything, and call you if it's serious," Marcus finished. "I know, Dad. I've got this." But as David watched his son maneuver out of the car with his crutches, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into territory where his skills meant nothing and his protection couldn't reach. Jessica Coleman was waiting by the main entrance as promised. She'd taught special education for 8 years before transitioning to general education, bringing with her a passion for inclusion that sometimes put her at odds with administrators more concerned with liability than learning. "Marcus," she called out, her smile genuine and warm. "Ready for 7th grade?" "Ready as I'll ever be," Marcus replied, and Jessica caught the quick glance he exchanged with his father, a moment of communication that spoke of shared strength and mutual protection. David extended his hand. "Staff Sergeant Thompson, we spoke on the phone." "Of course, thank you for your service." Jessica's handshake was firm, her eye contact direct. She recognized the hypervigilance in David's posture, the way his gaze swept the hallway for potential threats. Military family. She'd taught enough of them to recognize the signs. Marcus is going to do great here. I've already spoken with his other teachers about accommodations. Any problems, you call me directly, David said, handing her a card with his cell number. I work at the Millbrook manufacturing plant, but I can be here in 10 minutes. Jessica nodded, understanding the deeper message. This wasn't just a concerned parent. This was a warrior entrusting his most precious asset to her care. As David left, Jessica guided Marcus through the hallway, noting how his classmates' eyes followed his crutches with the curious mixture of fascination and discomfort that middle schoolers brought to anything different. They'll get used to you, she said quietly. Give them a week and the crutches will just be part of who you are. I hope so, Marcus replied, though his tone suggested he'd learned not to expect easy acceptance. In homeroom, Tyler Brennan was the first to approach. Tall for 13, with the easy confidence of someone who'd never faced real adversity, he slid into the seat next to Marcus with a practiced smile. Hey, new guy, Tyler Brennan. He extended his hand with theatrical friendliness. Those are some serious crutches. You play any sports? Marcus recognized the tone, not quite mockery, but something carefully calibrated to establish social hierarchy. Not really. I'm more into academics. Smart guy, huh? That's cool. We need more. Smart guys around here. Tyler's eyes held a calculating gleam that Marcus couldn't quite interpret. Maybe you can help me with my history homework sometime. Before Marcus could respond, Jessica called for attention, and Tyler's focus shifted with the fluid ease of someone accustomed to managing multiple social interactions simultaneously. At lunch, Marcus found himself navigating the complex geography of the cafeteria, a social ecosystem where invisible boundaries determined status and belonging. He'd settled at an empty table near the windows when he noticed the commotion. 3 tables over. A small girl with dark hair was hunched over what appeared to be a destroyed art project, tears streaming down her face. Tyler and 2 friends stood nearby, their expressions a careful mixture of fake concern and barely concealed amusement. Sorry about your picture, Emma, Tyler was saying, his voice carrying just far enough to attract attention. Accidents happen, you know. Maybe you should be more careful where you leave your stuff. Marcus watched Emma Rodriguez gather the torn pieces of what had been a detailed pencil drawing, her hands shaking as she tried to salvage something from the destruction. The other students at nearby tables either looked away or watched with the uncomfortable fascination of witnesses to a public humiliation. Something twisted in Marcus's chest, the same feeling he got when he watched his father's jaw tighten. During his therapy sessions, the recognition of injustice that demanded action, even when action seemed impossible. He started to rise from his seat, then caught Tyler's eyes across the cafeteria. The older boy's gaze was steady, assessing, as if measuring Marcus's reaction and filing it away for future reference. The moment stretched between them, a silent communication that spoke of boundaries being tested and challenges being issued. Marcus remained standing, his crutches supporting him as he stared back with the quiet determination his father had taught him was more powerful than rage. Tyler's smile never wavered, but something shifted in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation. When David picked up Marcus that afternoon, he immediately sensed the change in his son's posture, a slight tension that hadn't been there that morning. How was it? David asked as they drove home. Fine, Marcus replied, but his voice carried the careful neutrality David recognized from his own debriefings after difficult missions. Just fine? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching the suburban landscape roll past. There's a kid named Tyler. He seems complicated. David's protective instincts sharpened. Complicated how? I'm not sure yet, but there's a girl, Emma, who I think he's targeting. She seems really scared. That evening at dinner, Sarah listened to Marcus's carefully edited account of his first day with the practiced attention of a pediatric nurse who'd learned to read between the lines of what children said and didn't say. "It sounds like you handled everything well," she said, reaching across to squeeze Marcus's hand. "New schools are always an adjustment." "I just want to fit in," Marcus said quietly. "But I also don't want to ignore things that are wrong." David looked up from his plate, recognizing the moral conflict in his son's voice. Sometimes doing the right thing means not fitting in. Sometimes it means standing alone. "I know," Marcus replied. "You taught me that." That night, David jolted awake to the familiar sound of an explosion that existed only in his memory. His heart hammered against his ribs as he fought to separate past from present, Afghanistan from Pennsylvania, the IED blast that had ended his military career, from the quiet suburb where his family now slept. Sarah's hand found his shoulder in the darkness. "The nightmare again." "Yeah." David's voice was rough with residual terror. "Same one. The one where you can't reach your squad?" David nodded, though she couldn't see him in the dark. The dream was always the same. His Marines under fire, calling for help he couldn't provide, dying while he watched helplessly from behind barriers he couldn't break through. "Marcus is going to be okay," Sarah whispered, understanding the deeper fear that fueled his nightmares. "He's strong, he's smart, and he has good instincts." "He has a target on his back," David replied. "In that school, with his disability, his refusal to back down from doing what's right, he's going to be a target." Sarah was quiet for a moment, her hand still steady on his shoulder. "Then we make sure he's not facing it alone." As David finally drifted back to sleep, he couldn't shake the image of Marcus standing in that cafeteria, crutches supporting him as he stared down. A potential threat with the same quiet courage David had once brought to the battlefield. Some wars, David realized, never really ended. They just moved to different territory. Some wars, David realized, never really ended. They just moved to different territory. The realization haunted him through the following weeks as Marcus settled into the rhythm of Lincoln Middle School, each day bringing new challenges that David could only hear about secondhand. His son had inherited his mother's diplomatic skills, offering carefully measured responses about his school experiences that revealed just enough to satisfy parental concern while concealing the details that would trigger David's protective rage. But David had spent too many years reading between the lines of mission reports to miss the subtle signs. Marcus's backpack showed new scuff marks. His homework assignments occasionally bore mysterious tears or water stains. Most telling of all, his son had developed the 1,000-yard stare David recognized from his own mirror, the look of someone constantly scanning for threats. "You sure everything's okay at school?" David asked one morning as they drove through Millbrook's quiet streets. Marcus adjusted his grip on his crutches. A gesture David had learned indicated his son was choosing his words carefully. "It's middle school, Dad. Nothing's ever really okay." The answer was true enough to deflect further questioning while revealing absolutely nothing. David filed it away with growing unease. At Lincoln Middle School, Tyler Brennan was conducting his own reconnaissance. For 2 weeks, he'd been studying Marcus Thompson with the patience of a predator, learning its prey's habits. The new kid was smart. That much was obvious from the way teachers deferred to his insights during class discussions. He was also stubborn, refusing to accept the social hierarchy that Tyler had spent years establishing. More problematically, Marcus seemed immune to the subtle intimidation tactics that worked so effectively on other students. When Tyler's friends accidentally blocked accessible routes, Marcus simply found alternatives without complaint. When they mimicked his speech patterns just loudly enough for him to hear, He responded with the kind of measured calm that suggested inner strength rather than resignation. "He's not getting the message," Jake Morrison whispered to Tyler during lunch, nodding toward Marcus, who sat alone reading a book while eating his sandwich one-handed. "He's getting it," Tyler replied, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd never met a problem he couldn't solve through manipulation. "He's just choosing to ignore it. That makes him interesting." Tyler's calculation was interrupted by Emma Rodriguez hurrying past their table, her art supplies clutched protectively against her chest. The small sixth grader had been Tyler's primary target since the beginning of the school year, easy prey who provided reliable entertainment without significant risk of retaliation. "Hey, Emma," Tyler called out with false friendliness. "How's the art project coming along?" Emma's step faltered, but she didn't respond. Her silence only encouraged Tyler's performance for his audience. "I heard you're doing something about your family. That's sweet, really sweet." Tyler's tone carried just enough condescension to make the compliment feel like mockery. "Maybe you could draw your dad in his uniform, before he got transferred because of—" "What was it?" "Again?" Emma's face flushed red, but she kept walking. Tyler's friends snickered appreciatively at the reference to the family drama that had necessitated Emma's father's sudden transfer from his previous base, a sensitive topic that Tyler had somehow learned about and weaponized. Marcus looked up from his book, his attention drawn by the familiar sound of calculated cruelty. He watched Emma disappear into the hallway, then turned his gaze to Tyler's table. Their eyes met across the cafeteria, and Tyler offered him a smile that was equal parts invitation and challenge. "Choose your battles," David had taught him, "but when you choose to fight, you fight to win." Marcus closed his book and stood, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Several students at nearby tables noticed his approach, conversations quieting as they sensed the potential for drama. "Tyler," Marcus said, his voice carrying despite his speech impediment. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Tyler's eyebrows rose with theatrical surprise. "Sure, Marcus. What's on your mind?" "Emma Rodriguez isn't bothering anyone. Maybe you could leave her alone." The cafeteria had grown noticeably quieter. Tyler looked around at his audience, then back at Marcus, with the kind of smile that preceded something unpleasant. "I don't know what you're talking about, man. Emma and I are friends. I was just being friendly." Tyler's voice carried just far enough to be heard by nearby tables. "Maybe you misunderstood. Sometimes people do that when they can't hear properly." The reference to Marcus's partial hearing loss, information Tyler had somehow acquired, landed with surgical precision. Several students shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the cruelty disguised as concern. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks, but kept his voice level. "I heard you fine, and what I heard was you being cruel to someone who can't defend herself." Defend herself from what?" Tyler spread his hands innocently. "From friendship, from conversation. Marcus, I think you might be a little confused about how things work here." Jake Morrison leaned forward with a grin. "Yeah, maybe someone should explain the social dynamics to our new friend. Help him understand how to fit in." "I understand perfectly," Marcus replied, his grip tightening on his crutches. "I understand that you think being cruel makes you strong. I understand that you target people you think can't fight back, and I understand that you're wrong about both of those things." The challenge hung in the air between them like smoke from a fired weapon. Tyler's smile remained fixed, but something had shifted in his eyes, a recognition that this wasn't going according to his usual script. "Careful, Marcus," Tyler said quietly, his voice losing its theatrical quality. "You're new here. You don't understand how things work yet. Maybe you should take some time to figure that out before you start making accusations." "Is that a threat?" It's friendly advice from one student to another. Marcus held Tyler's gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Thanks for the advice. Here's some in return. Leave Emma alone. Find someone your own size to bother. As Marcus walked away, Tyler watched him go with the calculating expression of someone who'd just identified his next major project. The new kid had just made things infinitely more interesting and infinitely more complicated. In her classroom down the hall, Jessica Coleman was grading papers when she heard raised voices from the direction of the cafeteria. She'd been teaching long enough to recognize the particular tone that preceded either a fight or its aftermath. When she saw Marcus Thompson walking past her doorway with the carefully controlled posture of someone who'd just confronted a threat, her protective instincts sharpened. That afternoon, she made a note to herself to pay closer attention to the social dynamics around her newest student. Something in Marcus's expression reminded her too much of her younger brother in the weeks before his suicide. The look of someone fighting battles that adults either couldn't see or chose to ignore. When David picked up Marcus that afternoon, he immediately noticed the change in his son's posture. The careful neutrality was gone, replaced by something harder and more determined. "How was school today?" David asked. "Educational," Marcus replied, and this time his voice carried an edge that made David's protective instincts snap to full alert. "Want to talk about it?" Marcus was quiet for several blocks, watching the familiar suburban landscape roll past. Finally, he spoke. "Dad, what do you do when doing the right thing makes everything harder for yourself?" The question hit David like a punch to the gut. He recognized it from his own experience. The moral conflict that came with standing up to injustice when staying silent would be safer and easier. "You do the right thing anyway," David said, "and you accept that sometimes that means standing alone. Even when you know it's going to make things worse? Especially then." That evening at dinner, Sarah noticed the tension radiating from both her husband and son like heat from a furnace. The careful conversation they maintained throughout the meal spoke of shared understanding and mutual protection, the kind of communication that developed between people who'd learned to fight battles others couldn't see. "Marcus, is there anything you want to talk about?" Sarah asked as she cleared the plates. "Not yet," Marcus replied, "but there might be soon." David met his son's eyes across the table, recognizing the quiet determination that meant Marcus had made a decision about something important. It was the same look David had worn before his first combat mission. The expression of someone who'd accepted that conflict was inevitable and was already planning for war. That night, David's nightmare was different. Instead of being unable to reach his squad, he dreamed of watching Marcus face down an enemy David couldn't identify, armed with nothing but crutches and the kind of moral courage that had gotten too many good people killed. He woke with the absolute certainty that his son's real battle was just beginning. He woke with the absolute certainty that his son's real battle was just beginning. David's instincts proved accurate within days. Tyler Brennan, having identified Marcus as a challenge to his social authority, began orchestrating a campaign of harassment that was both systematic and carefully calculated to avoid detection by adults. The attacks came in waves, seemingly accidental collisions in hallways that sent Marcus stumbling, jokes about his disability timed to coincide with teacher absences, and a pattern of social isolation that gradually cut him off from potential allies. Marcus endured it with the stoic determination his father had taught him, documenting each incident with military precision while refusing to give Tyler the satisfaction of a visible reaction. But Jessica Coleman, watching from her classroom, recognized the signs she'd missed with her brother years earlier, the gradual erosion of spirit that preceded complete collapse. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in the cafeteria when Emma Rodriguez accidentally dropped her lunch tray while trying to navigate around Tyler's deliberately outstretched leg. The crash of dishes echoed through the room like a gunshot, and Emma's face went crimson as she knelt to clean up the scattered food. Marcus was halfway across the cafeteria before he'd consciously decided to move, his crutches carrying him toward Emma with purpose that made several students step aside. Tyler watched his approach with the satisfied expression of someone whose trap was finally being sprung. "Need help?" Marcus asked Emma, lowering himself carefully to help gather the scattered items. "Thanks," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "You don't have to—" "Yes, he does," Tyler interrupted, rising from his table with theatrical concern. "Marcus here thinks he's everyone's hero. Don't you, Marcus?" The cafeteria had grown quiet, conversations dying as students sensed the electric tension building between the two boys. Tyler's friends flanked him with grins that suggested they'd been anticipating this moment. "I think people should help each other," Marcus replied, continuing to gather Emma's scattered belongings. "It's called basic decency." "Decency?" Tyler laughed, the sound carrying just enough volume to ensure a wide audience. "That's rich, coming from someone who can barely walk without falling over himself." The words hit the cafeteria like a physical blow. Several students gasped at the cruelty, while others pulled out their phones with the reflexive speed of a generation that documented everything. Marcus finished helping Emma, then stood slowly, his crutches supporting him as he faced Tyler directly. "At least when I fall, it's because of my disability. When you fall, it'll be because of your character." Tyler's smile faltered for just a moment before returning with renewed intensity. "Big words from someone who needs special help with everything. Tell me, Marcus, what's it like knowing you'll never be normal, never be able to do what everyone else takes for granted?" The cruelty was so naked, so precisely targeted, that even Tyler's usual supporters looked uncomfortable. But Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent cafeteria. "Normal is overrated. Tyler, I'd rather be disabled with honor than normal with none." The response clearly wasn't what Tyler had expected. His face flushed with frustration, and for a moment his carefully constructed persona slipped to reveal something uglier underneath. "Honor?" Tyler spat. "You want to talk about honor? Let's see how much honor you have when you're face down on the floor where you belong." Tyler's shove was perfectly calculated, not violent enough to be called assault, but forceful enough to send Marcus stumbling backward. Marcus's crutches tangled as he tried to maintain balance, and gravity took over with cruel inevitability. The fall seemed to happen in slow motion. Marcus hit the cafeteria floor hard, his crutches clattering away as he struggled to right himself. The sound echoed through the room like breaking bones, and for a moment the only noise was Marcus's labored breathing as he tried to push himself up with arms that trembled from both pain and humiliation. Tyler stood over him with mock concern, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Oh no, Marcus. Are you okay? Here, let me help you." He reached down as if to assist, then seemed to think better of it. "Actually, maybe you should stay down there. It seems to suit you." The laughter that followed was worse than the fall itself, not from everyone, but from enough students to create a wall of sound that felt like a physical assault. Marcus's face burned with shame as he continued his struggle to get upright, his disability making the simple act of standing an agonizing performance for his tormentors' entertainment. But it was Emma Rodriguez who broke the spell. The small sixth grader appeared beside Marcus, offering her hand with quiet dignity. "Here," she said, her voice stronger than anyone had heard it before. "Let me help." Her assistance, combined with Marcus's determination, got him back to his feet. As he retrieved his crutches, Marcus became aware of the phones pointed in his direction, dozens of them, recording his humiliation for posterity and viral distribution. "Great show, Marcus," Tyler said, his voice carrying to every corner of the cafeteria. "Really inspiring. I'm sure everyone here learned something important about perseverance." Marcus looked around the room, seeing faces that ranged from horrified sympathy to cruel amusement to uncomfortable avoidance. He understood with crystalline clarity that this moment would define his entire middle school experience, and possibly much more. "You're right, Tyler," Marcus said, his voice carrying despite his speech impediment. "Everyone did learn something important. They learned what a bully looks like when he thinks no one will stop him." Tyler's expression darkened. "And what did you learn, Marcus?" Marcus met his gaze steadily. "I learned that some people think cruelty makes them strong, and I learned that they're wrong." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of approaching adult footsteps. Coach Sullivan appeared in the cafeteria doorway, his expression suggesting he'd heard the commotion but hadn't seen its cause. "Everything okay in here?" he asked, his eyes scanning the room. "Everything's fine, Coach," Tyler replied smoothly. "Marcus just had a little accident. We were helping him up." Coach Sullivan's gaze lingered on Marcus, taking in his flushed face and Emma's protective stance beside him. "That right, son?" Marcus looked at the coach, then at Tyler, then at the phones still recording. He understood that this was his moment to choose: report the incident and face Tyler's retaliation, or stay silent and signal his acceptance of his role as victim. "Just an accident," Marcus said quietly. "I'm fine." But as the crowd dispersed, and normal cafeteria noise resumed, Marcus knew he wasn't fine. None of this was fine. And the videos already being uploaded to social media would ensure that his humiliation spread far beyond the walls of Lincoln Middle School. When David arrived for pickup that afternoon, he immediately sensed the change in the school's atmosphere. Students clustered around phones with the guilty excitement of people sharing something they knew they shouldn't. Marcus emerged from the building, walking more carefully than usual, his face set in the expression David recognized as his son's: war mask. "How was school?" David asked, studying Marcus's posture for signs of injury. "It's going viral," Marcus replied, his voice carrying a bitterness that made David's protective instincts roar to life. "What's going viral?" Marcus handed over his phone, showing David a video that had already been viewed thousands of times. The footage was edited to make Tyler appear concerned and helpful, while making Marcus's struggle to get up look pitiful and prolonged. The comment section was a cesspool of cruel mockery and fake sympathy. David watched his son's humiliation play out on the small screen, feeling something cold and deadly settle in his chest. The video ended with Tyler's voice offering false concern. "Are you okay? Here, let me help you." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "The whole school has seen it," Marcus said quietly, "and half the town by now. Tomorrow it'll probably be everywhere." David's hands shook as he handed the phone back, his combat training warring with civilian restraint. Every instinct screamed at him to drive back to the school, find Tyler Brennan, and demonstrate what real consequences looked like. Instead, he started the car with forced calm. "We're going to fix this." "How?" Marcus asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. David was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as he fought for control. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the cold certainty of someone who'd made a decision. "I'm going to make some phone calls." That night, after Marcus had gone to bed and Sarah had reviewed the video with the clinical detachment of a medical professional assessing trauma, David sat in his garage surrounded by boxes of military memorabilia he hadn't opened since his discharge. His phone felt heavy in his hand as he scrolled through his contacts, looking for numbers he hadn't called in years. Numbers that connected him to people who understood concepts like honor, protection, and proportional response to threats against the innocent. His finger hovered over Gunnery Sergeant Maria Rodriguez's contact information, the woman who'd trained him, fought beside him, and helped him survive the transition from warrior to civilian. The woman who'd once told him that the brotherhood never really ended, it just waited for the call. David hit the number and listened to it ring, knowing he was about to cross a line between civilian parent and military tactician. But as he thought about his son's humiliation playing out for thousands of viewers, he realized he'd already made his choice. Some battles required more than civilian solutions. Some battles required more than civilian solutions. The phone rang 3 times before Maria Rodriguez answered with the crisp professionalism that had made her one of the Marine Corps' most respected drill instructors. "This is Gunny Rodriguez." "Gunny, it's David Thompson." His voice carried the weight of 8 years since they'd last spoken, but the connection between them was immediate and unbreakable. "Devil dog!" Maria's tone shifted from professional to warmly personal. "How the hell are you, Thompson? Sarah? Marcus?" "Not good, Gunny. That's why I'm calling." David took a steadying breath, knowing he was about to ask for something that went far beyond normal friendship. "I need help, and I need it from people who understand what honor actually means." The silence that followed was heavy with recognition. Maria had received calls like this before, Marines who'd transitioned to civilian life only to discover that the values they'd fought to protect weren't always shared by the institutions they now had to navigate. "Tell me," Maria said simply. David explained the situation with military precision, laying out the facts without editorial comment. Marcus's disability, the escalating harassment, the school's inadequate response, and finally, the viral video that had turned his son's humiliation into entertainment for thousands. "The civilian system has failed my family, Gunny," David concluded. "My son is under attack, and I can't protect him using their rules. I need Marines who understand that some things are worth fighting for." Maria was quiet for a long moment, processing the request and its implications. "David, you know I can't just roll up to a civilian school with a squad of drill instructors and start throwing weight around." "I'm not asking you to intimidate anyone," David replied. "I'm asking you to teach about leadership, about courage, about what it means to protect people who can't protect themselves. Things these kids have never learned because the adults in their lives are more worried about liability than character." "And you think a few Marines in dress blues can change that?" "I think Marines who've actually faced real threats might have credibility with kids who've only known pretend ones." David's voice carried the conviction of someone who'd thought this through completely. "I think seeing real strength might help them understand the difference between power and cruelty." Maria considered this, her mind already working through logistics and potential complications. She'd been watching her fellow Marines struggle with civilian transitions for over 2 decades, and she'd seen too many good people broken by systems that didn't value the principles they'd fought to defend. "This would have to be done right," she said finally. "Educational outreach, properly coordinated with the school, no unauthorized displays of force." "Understood. But Gunny, these people need to understand that there are consequences for failing to protect the vulnerable. They need to see what real leadership looks like. Give me 24 hours to make some calls." David felt something loosen in his chest for the first time in weeks. "Thank you, Gunny." "Don't thank me yet, Thompson. If we do this, we do it right. No half measures, no shortcuts. Either we solve this problem completely, or we don't touch it at all." After ending the call, David sat in his garage, surrounded by memories of a time when problems had clear solutions and honor meant something absolute. The transition to civilian life had been harder than any combat deployment, largely because the enemy was harder to identify and the rules of engagement kept changing without notice. Meanwhile, at Quantico Marine Base, Maria Rodriguez was already making the calls that would either save Marcus Thompson's school experience or create a diplomatic incident that would end her career. She started with Staff Sergeant James Williams, a former infantry marine who transitioned to drill instructor duties after multiple combat deployments. "Tank, I need you to think outside the box on something," Maria began, knowing that Williams' background in foster care would make him particularly sympathetic to stories of institutional failure to protect children. "What kind of outside the box, Gunny?" "The kind where we take military leadership principles into a civilian environment and demonstrate why our values matter beyond the core." Williams was quiet for a moment. "This about Thompson's kid? You know about it. Saw the video. Made me sick to my stomach. That boy showed more courage in 30 seconds than most adults manage in a lifetime." "The school systems failed him, Tank. The parents have failed him. The whole civilian support structure has collapsed, and now a good kid is paying the price. What do you need?" "I need the best educational outreach presentation you've ever put together. Something that teaches these kids about real leadership, real courage, and real consequences. And I need it to be so professionally executed that no administrator can find fault with it." "When do you need it?" "Yesterday." Williams chuckled, a sound that carried both amusement and grim determination. "Roger that, Gunny. I'll loop in Davis from the Cyber Warfare Unit. If this involves social media and online harassment, we need someone who understands that battlefield." The next call was to Corporal Rachel Davis, the youngest member of their potential team, but also the most qualified to address the digital aspects of modern bullying. At 29, Davis bridged the gap between military discipline and contemporary technology in ways that older Marines sometimes struggled with. "Ma'am, I've been following the Thompson situation on social media," Davis said when Maria explained the mission parameters. "The video's been shared across multiple platforms and the comment threads are brutal. This isn't just school bullying anymore, it's community-wide harassment. Can you address that aspect of it?" "Absolutely. But ma'am, we need to understand that once we engage with this, we become part of the story. If we do this right, it could become a model for how military leadership principles can positively impact civilian communities. If we do it wrong, we don't do things wrong, Davis." "Understood, ma'am. I'll prepare materials on digital citizenship and cyber responsibility. These kids need to understand that their online actions have real-world consequences." As Maria coordinated her team, David was facing a different kind of battle at Lincoln Middle School. Principal Hendricks had agreed to meet with him after David's increasingly insistent calls about the viral video and its impact on his son. "Mr. Thompson, I understand your concerns," Hendricks began, his tone carrying the weary patience of an administrator who'd heard variations of this conversation many times. "But we've investigated the incident, and it appears to have been an unfortunate accident." "An accident?" David's voice remained level, but something in his posture made Hendricks shift uncomfortably. "My son was deliberately pushed. It was recorded and edited to maximize his humiliation. How exactly is that an accident?" "The video is concerning, certainly, but we can't discipline students based on external social media activity unless it directly disrupts the school environment." David stared at the principal for a long moment, recognizing the bureaucratic doublespeak that prioritized legal protection over student welfare. "So you're telling me that as long as they humiliate my son cleverly enough to avoid technical violations of your policies, there will be no consequences?" "Mr. Thompson, I understand you're frustrated." "No, Mr. Hendricks, you don't understand. You don't understand what it means to protect people who depend on you. You don't understand that leadership means taking responsibility for what happens under your command. And you clearly don't understand that some things are more important than covering your administrative ass." Hendrik's face flushed at the barely concealed contempt in David's voice. "Mr. Thompson, I'm going to have to ask you to moderate your tone." "My tone is the least of your problems," David interrupted, standing to leave. "Your failure to protect the students in your care is about to become a much bigger issue than you realize." As David left the school, his phone buzzed with a text from Maria Rodriguez. "Mission authorized. ETA tomorrow, IR 800. Semper Fi." David felt a grim smile cross his face. The civilian system had failed his family, but the Brotherhood never did. Tomorrow, Lincoln Middle School was about to learn what real leadership looked like. Tomorrow, Lincoln Middle School was about to learn what real leadership looked like. But first, the operation required the kind of meticulous planning that had kept David's squad alive through 3 combat tours. At 0600 hours, Maria Rodriguez stood before a tactical whiteboard at Quantico, addressing her hand-picked team with the same intensity she brought to preparing Marines for deployment. "Gentlemen, lady, this is not a military operation, but it requires military precision," Maria began, her voice carrying the authority that had shaped thousands of young Marines. "We are conducting educational outreach to a civilian school that has failed to address systematic harassment of a disabled student. Our mission is to demonstrate leadership principles and establish lasting behavioral change." Staff Sergeant Williams studied the intelligence packet David had provided. School layout, class schedules, administrative structure, and detailed profiles of the key players. His foster care background had taught him to read institutional dysfunction, and Lincoln Middle School showed all the classic signs. "The principal's a weak link," Tank observed, tapping Hendrik's photo. "Classic bureaucrat. He'll either try to control the narrative or distance himself from any controversy." "Which is why we go through the teacher," Maria replied, indicating Jessica Coleman's information. Former special education, military family background, frustrated with administrative inaction. She's our natural ally. Corporal Davis was analyzing the social media landscape on her laptop, tracking the viral spread of Marcus's humiliation with professional detachment. The video's been shared over 50,000 times across platforms. Comment threads show classic mob mentality. Kids from other schools piling on because it's safe to attack someone who can't fight back digitally. "Threat assessment?" Maria asked. "Tyler Brennan's got sophisticated media manipulation skills for a 13-year-old. He's not just a school bully, he's running a psychological warfare campaign. The editing on that video was designed to maximize humiliation while maintaining plausible deniability." Williams pulled up Tyler's academic record and extracurricular activities. Star athlete, wealthy family, parents are lawyers. He's used to consequences not applying to him. That's going to be our biggest challenge. "The biggest challenge," Maria corrected, "is doing this without looking like military overreach. We need to transform these kids' understanding of strength and leadership while remaining within educational guidelines." Davis had been mapping the social networks within the school, identifying key influencers and potential allies. Emma Rodriguez is the victim who triggered Marcus's intervention. Her family has military connections. Father's an Army logistics officer recently transferred here. If we can reach her, we might have another ally. "What about the other students?" Tank asked. "Mostly followers. They're not inherently cruel. They're just operating in a system where cruelty is rewarded and intervention is punished. Change the incentive structure, and their behavior will follow." Maria studied the photographs David had provided of Marcus. A slight 12-year-old whose disability made him physically vulnerable, but whose eyes carried the same determination. She'd seen in the best Marines under her command. The boy had inherited his father's moral courage along with his stubborn streak. "The kid's got warrior spirit," she observed. "He stood up to protect someone weaker despite knowing it would make him a target. That's the kind of character we build our cause around. Question is whether we can protect him while teaching the others," Williams said. "If we handle this wrong, it could make things worse for him." "Then we don't handle it wrong," Maria replied with finality. "Davis, what's our social media strategy?" "We document everything. Professional presentation, clear educational objectives, measurable outcomes. If this goes viral, and it probably will, we want the narrative to be about positive military leadership, not intimidation of civilians." Williams had been developing the educational presentation, drawing on years of experience transforming undisciplined recruits into disciplined Marines. "I'm structuring it around 3 core principles: leadership through service, strength through protection of others, and honor through personal accountability." Specific examples? Military. Leadership scenarios adapted for civilian context. Real stories about Marines who showed courage by defending others, who demonstrated strength through restraint, who built their reputation through consistent character rather than dominance. Maria nodded approvingly. "What about practical application? Interactive scenarios. We present situations similar to what these kids face: bullying, peer pressure, moral choices, and walk them through decision-making processes that prioritize group welfare over individual advancement." Davis looked up from her laptop. "I'm preparing a segment on digital citizenship. These kids need to understand that online actions have real-world consequences, that viral videos can destroy lives, and that true strength includes protecting people even in virtual spaces." "How do we address Tyler specifically?" Tank asked. Maria considered this carefully. "We don't single him out. That would backfire. Instead, we create an environment where his behavior is clearly identified as weakness rather than strength. We give the other kids a new framework for understanding what real leadership looks like. And if he challenges us directly, then we demonstrate the difference between leadership and dominance through our response. We show strength through restraint, authority through competence, and power through principle." Meanwhile, David was conducting his own reconnaissance mission at the Millbrook manufacturing plant, where his reputation as a reliable supervisor had earned him respect from both management and workers. He'd mentioned the situation to his immediate supervisor, not asking for special consideration, but ensuring his chain of command understood why he might need to leave suddenly if the school situation escalated. "Thompson, you need anything from us on this?" his supervisor asked. "Company's got resources for employees dealing with family crises." "Appreciate it, but I've got it handled," David replied. "Just need you to know why I might seem distracted this week." The truth was, David felt more focused than he had since his discharge. Having a clear mission with defined objectives reminded him why he'd joined the Marines in the first place: to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. That evening, Jessica Coleman received an unexpected phone call from a Marine recruiter, asking about educational outreach opportunities. The conversation was professional and carefully structured, but something about the timing made her suspicious. "Ms. Coleman, we're developing a leadership education program for middle school students. We understand you have experience with both special education and military families." "That's correct," Jessica replied cautiously. "Would you be interested in hosting a presentation about leadership principles and character development? We're particularly focused on anti-bullying initiatives and building inclusive communities." Jessica felt a flutter of hope mixed with concern. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. What would this presentation involve? Professional military personnel discussing real-world leadership challenges, interactive exercises, about moral courage and practical applications for students facing difficult social situations. When were you thinking of scheduling this? Tomorrow, if your administration approves. We understand there's been some recent incidents that might make this particularly relevant. Jessica made her decision. I'll speak with the principal tonight. If he approves, we can make this happen. After ending the call, she sat in her classroom grading papers and thinking about Marcus Thompson's quiet dignity in the face of systematic cruelty. If this mysterious military intervention could help him and students like Emma Rodriguez, then she would find a way to make it work. Her phone buzzed with a text from David Thompson. Change is coming. Thanks for caring about my son. Jessica smiled despite herself. Sometimes the best solutions came from the most unexpected directions. Tomorrow would either be a breakthrough or a disaster, but it wouldn't be another day of watching good kids suffer while adults failed them. Tomorrow would either be a breakthrough or a disaster, but it wouldn't be another day of watching good kids suffer while adults failed them. At 7:45 hours, 3 Marines in dress blue uniforms walked through the front doors of Lincoln Middle School with the bearing of professionals arriving to conduct important business. Their presence transformed the hallway atmosphere instantly. Conversations quieted, postures straightened, and even the most disruptive students seemed to sense that something significant was happening. Principal Hendricks met them at the main office, his bureaucratic composure barely concealing his nervous energy. The phone call from Jessica Coleman the night before had caught him off guard, but the official documentation from Marine Corps Community Relations had left him little room to object without appearing unpatriotic. "Welcome to Lincoln Middle School," Hendricks said, extending his hand to Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez. "I understand you're here for some kind of leadership presentation." "Educational outreach, sir," Maria replied with crisp professionalism. "Character development and anti-bullying initiatives. We appreciate your school's commitment to providing students with diverse learning opportunities." Hendricks nodded, though his expression suggested he was still processing how this had been arranged so quickly. "Ms. Coleman's classroom is ready for you. 7th grade, 28 students. Outstanding. We'll need approximately 90 minutes to cover our curriculum objectives." As they walked toward Jessica's classroom, Staff Sergeant Williams carried himself with the relaxed confidence of someone comfortable with command in any environment. His massive frame and gentle demeanor created an interesting contrast that students noticed immediately. Here was someone who could clearly handle physical confrontation, but chose not to project intimidation. Corporal Davis brought up the rear, her laptop bag containing carefully prepared materials about digital citizenship and the real-world consequences of online behavior. At 29, she was close enough in age to connect with the students while maintaining the authority that came with her military bearing. Jessica Coleman waited in her classroom doorway, greeting her students with barely contained anticipation. She'd spent the morning rearranging desks to accommodate the presentation and preparing her class for something she suspected would be more impactful than routine educational outreach. Marcus Thompson entered the classroom with his usual careful dignity, unaware that his father had set extraordinary forces in motion on his behalf. He took his customary seat near the front, adjusting his crutches with practiced efficiency while scanning the room for potential threats, a habit that had become second nature over the past weeks. Tyler Brennan swaggered in with his usual confidence, flanked by his core supporters. He noticed the unusual classroom arrangement, but showed no particular concern. In Tyler's experience, adult authority figures were easily manipulated or simply ignored until they lost interest in whatever cause had temporarily captured their attention. Emma Rodriguez slipped quietly into her seat near the back, her art supplies clutched protectively against her chest. The past weeks had been a nightmare of public humiliation and social isolation, but today something felt different. There was an energy in the room that suggested change, though whether for better or worse remained unclear. At precisely 0800 hours, Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez entered the classroom, her presence commanding immediate attention without requiring verbal direction. 28 seventh graders fell silent as she walked to the front of the room, her dress blue uniform and confident bearing making it clear that this was not going to be a typical school presentation. "Good morning," Maria said, her voice carrying easily to every corner of the room. "I'm Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez, United States Marine Corps. With me are Staff Sergeant Williams and Corporal Davis. We're here to talk with you about leadership, courage, and what it really means to be strong." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that the adult in front of him represented the same values his father had tried to instill in him. This was someone who understood concepts like honor and duty in ways that civilian authority figures seemed to have forgotten. Tyler, meanwhile, was calculating how to turn this unexpected development to his advantage. Military personnel often responded well to his practiced charm and apparent respect for authority, tools that had served him well with coaches and other adult mentors. "How many of you think you know what courage looks like?" Maria asked, scanning the room with the same attention she brought to evaluating new recruits. Several hands went up, including Tyler's. Maria nodded to him. "What's your name, son?" "Tyler Brennan, ma'am. And I think courage is standing up for yourself when people try to push you around." "Interesting perspective, Tyler. Staff Sergeant Williams. Would you agree with that definition?" Tank stepped forward, his massive presence making several students sit up straighter. "That's one type of courage, Tyler, but in my experience, the truest courage is standing up for other people when they can't stand up for themselves." "Can you give us an example?" Jessica asked, recognizing the carefully orchestrated nature of this exchange. "Afghanistan, 2018, Williams replied, his voice carrying the weight of lived experience. "My squad was providing security for a medical convoy when we came under fire. Our medic, guy named Peterson, could have taken cover and waited for backup. Instead, he ran across open ground under enemy fire to reach wounded Afghan civilians who'd been caught in the crossfire." The classroom was completely silent now, students riveted by the authentic detail of Williams's story. "Peterson wasn't the biggest guy in our unit, or the strongest, or the most heavily armed," Williams continued. "But he understood something that made him stronger than any of us, that real strength comes from protecting people who need protection." Marcus felt tears prick his eyes as he recognized the validation he'd been seeking for weeks. This was what he'd tried to do for Emma, protect someone who needed protection. "What happened to Peterson?" Emma asked quietly. Speaking up for the first time anyone could remember, Williams smiled. "He saved 3 lives that day, including a little girl about your age. And when we got back to base, nobody called him weak or different or special needs. They called him a hero." Corporal Davis stepped forward, her laptop connected to the classroom's display system. "That brings us to something we need to discuss with all of you. The difference between strength and cruelty, especially in digital spaces." A photograph appeared on the screen, not Marcus's viral video, but a similar scene of someone struggling while others watched and recorded. "How many of you have seen videos like this one?" Davis asked. Most hands went up reluctantly. Tyler's remained down, his expression suddenly wary. "Here's what I want you to understand," Davis continued. "Every time you share, comment on, or create content that humiliates another person, you're choosing to be weak. You're choosing to gain power by taking it away from someone who can't fight back." "But what if they deserve it?" one of Tyler's friends asked. "Deserve what?" Maria asked sharply. "Deserve to be humiliated? Deserve to be isolated? Deserve to have their worst moments broadcast for entertainment?" The questions hung in the air with uncomfortable weight. Several students who had shared Marcus's video suddenly found their desks fascinating. "Let me tell you what people deserve," Williams said, his voice gentle but unmistakable in its authority. "They deserve to be treated with dignity. They deserve to have someone stand up for them when they're vulnerable. And they deserve to be part of communities that make them stronger, not weaker." Marcus felt his composure threatening to break as the Marine's words validated everything he'd felt but couldn't articulate. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't alone with his burden. Tyler, meanwhile, was beginning to understand that this wasn't routine military recruitment. These Marines were here for a specific purpose, and that purpose was challenging everything he'd built his social status on. The real education was just beginning. The real education was just beginning. As the Marines concluded their presentation and filed out of Jessica Coleman's classroom, the silence they left behind was heavy with transformation. 28 seventh graders sat processing what they'd just experienced. Not a routine educational outreach, but a fundamental challenge to the social order that had governed their interactions for months. Marcus Thompson remained in his seat, overwhelmed by the validation he'd received from adults who understood what honor actually meant. For the first time since the viral video, he felt something other than isolation and shame. Staff Sergeant Williams had publicly acknowledged his moral courage. Corporal Davis had addressed the digital harassment he'd endured, and Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez had looked him in the eye with the respect one warrior shows another. Tyler Brennan, however, was experiencing something entirely unfamiliar, genuine consequences for his behavior from adults he couldn't manipulate or intimidate. The Marines had never mentioned his name directly, but their presentation had systematically dismantled every justification he'd used for his treatment of Marcus and Emma. Worse, several of his usual supporters were looking at him with expressions that suggested doubt about their allegiances. "That was intense," Jake Morrison whispered to Tyler as students began filing out for their next class. "It was propaganda," Tyler replied, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Military guys trying to make us feel guilty for normal middle school stuff." But Jake's attention had already shifted to Marcus, who was receiving genuine respect from classmates who had previously ignored or mocked him. The social dynamics that Tyler had carefully constructed were beginning to crumble. Principal Hendricks intercepted the Marines as they prepared to leave, his bureaucratic instincts finally catching up to what had just occurred in his school. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I need to understand exactly what just happened in that classroom," he said, his tone carrying the forced authority of someone trying to reassert control over a situation that had already moved beyond his influence. "Educational outreach, sir," Maria replied with professional courtesy that bordered on indifference. "Character development and leadership principles, exactly what we discussed. But this seems to have been targeted at specific students and specific incidents." "We addressed universal principles that apply to all students in all schools," Williams interrupted smoothly. "Leadership, courage, and personal responsibility aren't specific to any individual situation." Hendricks felt the ground shifting beneath his administrative feet. The presentation had been professionally executed and educationally sound, but it had also fundamentally challenged his preferred approach of avoiding confrontation until problems resolved themselves. "I'm going to need a full report on what was discussed." "Certainly," Davis replied, producing a tablet with official documentation. "Our curriculum objectives, presentation materials, and learning outcomes are all documented according to Marine Corps educational outreach protocols." As Hendricks reviewed the official paperwork, he realized he'd been outmaneuvered by professionals who understood bureaucracy better than he did. Every aspect of their visit was defensible, documented, and aligned with stated educational goals, even as it had accomplished something he'd been unwilling to attempt. Meanwhile, News of the Marine presentation was spreading through Lincoln Middle School with the viral intensity of adolescent communication networks. Students who hadn't been in Jessica's classroom heard second-hand accounts that grew more dramatic, with each retelling, while those who had witnessed it directly struggled to process the experience. Emma Rodriguez found herself surrounded by classmates for the first time in months, but now they were asking about her father's military service rather than avoiding her as a target of Tyler's harassment. The shift was both welcome and overwhelming. "Is it true your dad's in the army?" Ashley Chen asked during lunch, her tone carrying genuine interest rather than the performative sympathy Emma had grown to hate. "Yes," Emma replied cautiously, unsure whether this attention was safe. "That's really cool. My uncle was in the Navy. He always talks about looking out for your teammates." The conversation continued naturally, and Emma realized with surprise that she was making actual friends rather than simply avoiding enemies. Marcus experienced his own version of social rehabilitation as students who had previously treated him as either invisible or pitiable began approaching him with something approaching respect. The Marine's public acknowledgement of his courage had reframed his disability from weakness to overcome into strength to recognize. "Hey, Marcus," Kevin Walsh said after math class, his tone carrying none of the condescension Marcus had learned to expect. "That was pretty awesome what those Marines said about you standing up for Emma." "I just did what anyone should do," Marcus replied, though his words carried new confidence. "Yeah, but you actually did it. That takes guts." But the most significant reaction came from Tyler Brennan's usual circle of supporters who found themselves questioning loyalties they'd never examined before. The Marines had presented a different model of strength, one based on protection rather than domination, service rather than status. Tyler sensed the shift immediately and responded with escalating aggression designed to reassert his social control. "You guys are really buying into that military propaganda?" he asked during lunch, his voice carrying the desperate edge of someone feeling power slip away. "They came here because Marcus's daddy couldn't handle his kid getting treated like everyone else." "Maybe Marcus was getting treated worse than everyone else," Jake Morrison replied quietly, surprising himself with his honesty. Tyler's eyes narrowed. "Since when do you care about Marcus Thompson?" "Since I started thinking about what those Marines said, about strength and weakness." The conversation attracted attention from nearby tables, and Tyler realized he was losing the audience that had always validated his behavior. His response was to double down on the cruelty that had previously served him well. "You want to talk about strength and weakness?" Tyler said, his voice rising. "Marcus fell down in the cafeteria because he's weak. The video went viral because everyone could see it. That's not bullying, that's reality. But the words that had once carried social weight now sounded hollow and cruel to ears that had heard a different definition of strength. Several students looked away in obvious discomfort, while others exchanged glances that suggested Tyler's interpretation was no longer acceptable. Marcus, overhearing the conversation from 2 tables away, felt something new stirring in his chest. Not the familiar anxiety of being targeted, but the confidence that came from knowing he wasn't facing this alone anymore. 30 minutes after the Marines left Lincoln Middle School, Judge Patricia Brennan received a phone call from Principal Hendricks informing her that her son's school had been subjected to what appeared to be targeted military intervention designed to address Tyler's behavior. "Targeted how?" Patricia asked, her legal instincts immediately engaged. 3 Marines conducted what they called educational outreach, but it was clearly designed to address specific incidents involving Tyler and another student. Patricia felt cold anger settle in her chest. She'd built her legal career on protecting her clients from exactly this kind of institutional overreach, and she wasn't about to let her own son become a victim of military intimidation disguised as education. I want documentation of everything that was said and done, she told Hendricks. And I want to know who authorized this intervention and on what grounds. As Patricia began making calls to her network of legal and political contacts, she had no idea that her response would transform a local school incident into a community-wide debate about values, authority, and the proper role of military principles in civilian education. The Marines had achieved their immediate objective of supporting Marcus Thompson and challenging Tyler Brennan's behavior. But they had also triggered forces that would test their commitment to the principles they'd advocated. The real battle was about to begin. The real battle was about to begin. Within 48 hours of the Marine presentation, Millbrook found itself divided along lines that no one had anticipated. Judge Patricia Brennan had mobilized a coalition of concerned parents who viewed the Marine intervention as government overreach, transforming her living room into a legal war room. This sets a dangerous precedent, Patricia argued to the gathered parents. Today it's Marines telling our children how to behave. Tomorrow it could be any federal agency that decides our schools aren't meeting their standards. But Patricia's narrative faced unexpected resistance from Millbrook's substantial military community. David Thompson's phone rang constantly with calls from other military families who recognized the intervention as something to support rather than condemn. "David, this is Master Sergeant Collins," one caller said. "My daughter's been having similar problems at the high school. Can we talk?" By Thursday evening, David's garage had become an impromptu meeting space for families who understood that sometimes civilian institutions needed military principles to function effectively. Sarah watched her husband coordinate this network with renewed purpose, his PTSD symptoms improving as he found meaning in helping other families. At Lincoln Middle School, the changes were measurable. Marcus had gone from social pariah to respected peer, while Tyler Brennan found himself increasingly isolated as his behavior was reframed through the Marines' lens. Jessica Coleman documented students self-policing in ways she'd never seen before, intervening when they witnessed bullying and supporting vulnerable classmates with genuine enthusiasm. "It's remarkable," she told Dr. Amanda Foster. The same kids who were sharing cruel videos last week are now actively defending targets of harassment. "What about Tyler?" "Not well. He's escalating because his usual tactics aren't working. Yesterday he tried to organize a boycott of Marcus in gym class, but the other kids just ignored him." Amanda's professional training told her that Tyler's escalation was predictable but potentially dangerous. When she called to request a parent conference, Patricia's response was swift and decisive. "Dr. Foster, I'm scheduling a meeting with the school board to address the unauthorized military intervention that has disrupted my son's educational environment." Meanwhile, freelance journalist Marcus Webb had learned about the story through his Quantico sources, recognizing compelling elements that could go national: military values versus civilian authority, disability rights, cyberbullying, and institutional accountability. That evening, Millbrook's VFW Hall hosted a gathering that brought together military families and community members seeking understanding. The contrast with Patricia's legal strategy session was stark, where her meeting focused on technicalities and maneuvering. This gathering centered on practical solutions and shared values. Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez addressed the crowd with straightforward honesty. "We didn't come to impose military authority on civilian education. We came because a good kid was being systematically destroyed by institutional indifference, and his father asked for help from people who understand that protecting the vulnerable is everyone's responsibility." The spontaneous applause was sustained, but Rodriguez raised her hand for quiet. Real change has to come from this community, from parents, teachers, administrators, and students who decide that some things are more important than avoiding controversy. Tomorrow's school board meeting would determine whether courage and honor could flourish in civilian institutions, or whether bureaucratic convenience would continue to triumph over basic human decency. Tomorrow's school board meeting would determine whether courage and honor could flourish in civilian institutions, or whether bureaucratic convenience would continue to triumph over basic human decency. The Lincoln Middle School auditorium was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds spilling into hallways as Millbrook residents gathered for what had become the most contentious school board meeting in the district's history. Television crews from 3 regional news stations set up equipment while parents and community members filled every available seat. Patricia Brennan sat in the front row with her legal team and allied parents, their professional attire and coordinated talking points suggesting serious preparation. Across the aisle, David Thompson was surrounded by military families and community members whose children had benefited from the Marine intervention. School Board President Helen Martinez called the meeting to order with obvious nervousness. "We're here to discuss recent events at Lincoln Middle School and their impact on our educational environment." Patricia rose to address the board with practiced authority. The unauthorized military intervention at Lincoln Middle School represents a dangerous precedent that undermines parental authority and local control over education. My son Tyler has been subjected to targeted harassment disguised as educational outreach. Her presentation was polished and legally sound, but it was interrupted by an unexpected voice from the back of the auditorium. "That's not what happened." Noom. All heads turned to see Marcus Thompson standing with his crutches, his young voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room. Sarah reached out to steady him, but Marcus stepped forward with determination. "Tyler Brennan wasn't targeted by anyone," Marcus continued, his speech careful but unwavering. "He was shown what real strength looks like, and he didn't like learning that cruelty isn't strength." The auditorium erupted in murmurs as a 12-year-old boy with cerebral palsy became the moral center of a community debate about values and leadership. Board member Dr. Janet Collins leaned forward. "Marcus, can you tell us how the Marine presentation affected your school experience?" "It taught me that standing up for others isn't weakness, even when people try to make you think it is. It taught Emma Rodriguez that she deserves protection, and it taught other kids that they have choices about what kind of people they want to be." Emma Rodriguez stood next, her voice stronger than anyone had heard it before. "Marcus protected me when adults wouldn't. The Marines taught us that protecting others is what strong people do." One by one, students who had been in Jessica's classroom stood to share how the presentation had changed their understanding of leadership and responsibility. Their testimonies created a powerful counter-narrative to Patricia's legal arguments. Jessica Coleman addressed the board with professional authority. "In 20 years of teaching, I've never seen such positive behavioral change happen so quickly. The Marines didn't impose their values. They revealed values these students already possessed but had never seen modeled effectively. The school board's unanimous vote to formally adopt the Marine leadership curriculum as part of Lincoln Middle School's character education program surprised no one who had witnessed the student testimonies. Principal Hendricks announced his early retirement the following week, replaced by Dr. Janet Collins, who immediately implemented comprehensive anti-bullying policies based on military leadership principles. Tyler Brennan entered counseling and began the difficult work of understanding how his behavior had affected others. His first genuine apology to Marcus came 3 weeks later, marking the beginning of his own transformation. 6 months later, Marcus Thompson was elected to Student Council on a platform of inclusive leadership and peer advocacy. 6 months later, Marcus Thompson was elected to Student Council on a platform of inclusive leadership and peer advocacy. The transformation at Lincoln Middle School had become complete and permanent, embedded in the culture through policies, practices, and most importantly, the shared understanding among students that strength meant protecting others rather than dominating them. The hallways that had once been navigational minefields for vulnerable students now buzzed with the energy of genuine community. David Thompson stood in the back of the school auditorium, watching his son address a gathering of military families and community members who had come to celebrate the 6-month anniversary of what local media had dubbed the Brotherhood Intervention. Marcus's voice carried clearly through the room, his speech impediment no longer a source of shame, but simply one characteristic of a young leader who had learned to command respect through character rather than conformity. "When the Marines came to our school," Marcus said, gripping the podium with hands that no longer trembled when faced with public speaking, "they didn't solve our problems for us. They showed us we already had the tools to solve them ourselves. They showed us what courage actually looks like." The applause was sustained and genuine, coming from an audience that included not just Millbrook residents but educators and military personnel from across the region who had come to study a model that was being replicated in schools throughout Pennsylvania and beyond. Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez sat in the front row, her dress blue uniform bearing new ribbons that recognized her innovative approach to community engagement. The Marine Corps had officially adopted the Lincoln Middle School intervention as a template for educational outreach, with Rodriguez leading training programs for drill instructors across the country. "The brotherhood doesn't end when you leave active duty," Rodriguez had told a Pentagon briefing the previous month. "It extends to protecting the vulnerable in whatever community you find yourself." Thompson's boy reminded us that some fights are worth having, even in civilian spaces. The Marines' careers had been enhanced rather than harmed by their willingness to extend military values into civilian education. Staff Sergeant Williams had been promoted and transferred to lead the new character development initiative at Quantico, where his foster care background and natural teaching ability made him uniquely qualified to train other Marines in community outreach. Corporal Davis had become the Marine Corps' foremost expert on addressing cyberbullying and digital citizenship, traveling to schools across the country to teach students about the real-world consequences of online behavior. Her presentation materials had been adapted for use by civilian educators and were now part of the standard curriculum in over 200 school districts. Tyler Brennan sat 3 rows back, his transformation perhaps the most remarkable of all. The counseling program he'd entered had evolved into peer mediation training, and Tyler now worked alongside Marcus to address bullying incidents before they escalated. His understanding of social dynamics, once used for cruelty, had been redirected toward building inclusive communities. "I was wrong," Tyler had said during his public apology to Marcus 3 months earlier, his voice steady despite the difficulty of the admission. "I thought being cruel made me strong, but it just made me a smaller person. Marcus showed me what actual strength looks like, and the Marines taught me I could choose to be better." The apology had marked a turning point not just for Tyler, but for the entire school community. Students who had witnessed his genuine remorse and commitment to change began to understand that redemption was possible for anyone willing to do the difficult work of personal growth. Emma Rodriguez had emerged from her shell to become a confident advocate for other military children struggling with frequent moves and family deployments. Her artwork now decorated the school's main hallway, not hidden away in shame, but celebrated as expressions of resilience and hope. The quiet 6th grader who had once cowered in corners now led student committees and spoke at assemblies about the importance of protecting vulnerable community members. Judge Patricia Brennan sat in the middle section of the auditorium, her presence a testament to her own transformation. The woman who had initially mobilized legal opposition to the Marine intervention had quietly dropped her challenges and become an advocate for restorative justice programs in schools. Her legal expertise was now being used to help other districts implement similar programs without running afoul of regulatory requirements. I let my protective instincts for my son blind me to the harm he was causing others, Patricia had admitted during a private conversation with David Thompson. Sometimes the best way to protect our children is to help them understand that their actions have consequences for other people's children. Jessica Coleman, now assistant principal with a focus on inclusive education, had completed her master's degree in educational leadership with a thesis on integrating military leadership principles into civilian school environments. Her work was being studied by education departments at universities across the country, and she regularly consulted with other schools attempting to replicate Lincoln's success. The changes weren't limited to individual transformations. The school's entire approach to conflict resolution had been restructured around the principles the Marines had demonstrated: clear expectations, consistent enforcement, and emphasis on personal accountability. Students were trained as peer mediators, teachers received professional development in character education, and administrators were required to demonstrate measurable outcomes in creating inclusive environments. Dr. Amanda Foster had expanded her role to include community outreach, establishing support networks for military families transitioning to civilian communities. Her office had become a resource center that connected struggling families with mentors who understood their unique challenges. The program had become so successful that it was being funded by state grants and replicated in other military-adjacent communities. Sarah Thompson watched her husband address the gathering with pride that went beyond personal satisfaction. David had found his post-military mission, helping other veterans navigate the transition to civilian life while maintaining their core values. His PTSD symptoms had improved dramatically as he channeled his protective instincts into community service, and he now served as a consultant for other families facing similar challenges. The Marines taught us that individual courage can transform entire communities, David told the audience, his voice carrying the authority of lived experience. But the real lesson was that we all have the responsibility to create environments where the vulnerable are protected and the strong use their strength in service of others. Coach Sullivan, who had initially ignored the bullying in his gymnasium, now incorporated character development into his physical education curriculum. "I used to think toughening kids up meant letting them fight their own battles," he told the audience. "Now I understand that real toughness means stepping in when someone needs protection." Principal Janet Collins, who had replaced Hendricks after his early retirement, addressed the gathering with the enthusiasm of an educator who had seen transformative change. Lincoln Middle School has become a model for what's possible when communities commit to values-based education. We've had delegations from 12 states visit us this year, and the results speak for themselves. Bullying incidents down 90%, academic achievement up across all demographics, and student satisfaction at the highest levels we've ever measured. As the ceremony concluded, Marcus approached the microphone one final time. Next week, Lincoln Middle School will host our first annual Brotherhood Day, celebrating courage, service, and community protection. It's not about military versus civilian. It's about the values that make all of us stronger. He paused, looking out at an audience that included former enemies who had become allies, adults who had learned from children, and a community that had discovered its capacity for positive change. My dad always told me that some wars never really end. They just move to different territory. Well, this is our territory now, and we're going to defend it by making sure every kid who walks through our doors knows they're valued, protected, and capable of protecting others. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for Marcus, but for the understanding that individual moral courage, supported by institutional commitment and community engagement, could create lasting change that honored the best values of both military service and civilian democracy. Brotherhood, they had learned, wasn't limited by uniform or service record. It was defined by the willingness to stand up for those who needed protection, regardless of the cost to personal convenience or social status. In the months that followed, Lincoln Middle School would host dozens of visiting delegations, inspire legislation supporting character education in public schools, and become the subject of a documentary film about community transformation. But for the people gathered in that auditorium, the real victory was simpler and more profound. They had created a place where children could grow up believing that courage mattered, that kindness was strength, and that protecting others was everyone's responsibility. The mission would continue, carried forward by new generations who understood that some values were worth defending, no matter what territory the battle moved to. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.